The crystal chandelier cast rainbows across the marble floor of the Harrington estate's grand foyer as I watched my daughter Carrie's face drain of all color, her perfectly manicured hand trembling as she clutched her champagne flute, staring at the gold-embossed invitation that had just been placed in my weathered hands by the estate manager. "Mrs. Miranda Arlington," he announced with a respectful bow, "your table is ready in the VIP section. The Children's Hospital Board is honored to have our most generous patron join us for tonight's gala."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
My son Daniel's jaw literally dropped as every eye in the room turned toward me. Not Miranda Clyde, the quiet grandmother who scrubbed their toilets and mopped their floors, but Miranda Arlington, whose name graced the very hospital wing we were celebrating tonight. But let me back up and tell you how a woman worth $50 million ended up with her own children being ashamed to be seen with her in public. 3 years ago, I was living what most people would call the perfect life. I was Miranda Arlington, widow of real estate mogul Arthur Arlington, living in a sprawling mansion in the exclusive Willowbrook Heights. My children, Carrie and Daniel, both successful in their own right, would visit with their families every Sunday for elaborate dinners served by my housekeeper on fine china. Then came the phone call that changed everything. "Grandma Miranda," my granddaughter Elise had whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible over the cruel laughter in the background. "Please don't come to my graduation ceremony. The kids at school, they found out about your house, and they're calling me names. They said my family thinks we're better than everyone else." My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Here was my precious 15-year-old granddaughter, Arthur's pride and joy, being bullied because of the wealth that was supposed to protect and provide for her. When I confronted Carrie about it, her response cut even deeper. "Mom, you don't understand the pressure we're under," she had said, pacing nervously around my sunroom. "Daniel's trying to make partner at his law firm, and I'm building my real estate business. When people know about the Arlington money, they treat us differently. They assume everything we've accomplished is because of Dad's inheritance, not our own hard work." Daniel had nodded in agreement, adjusting his expensive tie uncomfortably. "Carrie's right, Mom. When clients find out we're Arthur Arlington's children, they either expect us to work for free because we're rich enough already, or they assume we're spoiled and incompetent. We need to earn respect on our own merits." I understood their point, but what happened next broke something fundamental inside me. "We think it would be best," Daniel had continued, his voice gentle but firm, "if you maybe lived more modestly, sold the mansion, got a smaller place, maybe even got a simple job, something that would help people see us as normal, hard-working Americans." Carrie had jumped in quickly. "It doesn't have to be anything fancy, Mom, just something to show people that we're not the entitled rich family everyone thinks we are." I stared at my children, my accomplished, intelligent children, and realized they were asking me to erase myself, to diminish who I was so they could feel more comfortable in their own skins. That's when I made a decision that would shock them to their core. Within 2 months, I had quietly sold the Willowbrook Heights mansion through a private trust, telling my children I was downsizing to a modest 3-bedroom house in the middle-class neighborhood of Maple Grove. What they didn't know was that I had purchased that house with cash from my weekly allowance, because the $50 million from the mansion sale had been quietly transferred into a series of investment accounts they knew nothing about. Then came the job. I applied to Premier House Services, the most exclusive cleaning company in the city, the same company that serviced the wealthiest families in Willowbrook Heights, including some of our former neighbors. When they asked about my experience, I simply said I had been managing my own household for decades and knew how to maintain high standards. Within a week, I was assigned to clean houses in the very neighborhood I had just left. My children were mortified. "Mom, this is humiliating," Carrie had hissed during one of our increasingly rare family dinners. "Do you have any idea how this looks? Gabe saw you coming out of the Morrison estate with a cleaning bucket. His colleagues at the country club were asking questions." Daniel had been more direct. "We can't have you working as a maid, Mom. It reflects poorly on all of us. What if my clients find out? What if Elise's friends see you?" And that's when I truly understood the depth of their shame. They weren't worried about my dignity or my happiness. They were worried about their image. So I made another decision. If they were going to be ashamed of me anyway, I might as well use this opportunity to see who they really were when they thought I couldn't help their careers or social standing anymore. For 3 years, I scrubbed floors, cleaned bathrooms, and dusted furniture in the homes of millionaires, while my own children avoided being seen with me in public. I watched them make excuses for why I couldn't attend Elisa's school events, why I shouldn't come to Daniel's work gatherings, why it would be better if I stayed home during their dinner parties. I learned things during those 3 years that no amount of money could have taught me. I learned exactly what my children thought of people they considered beneath them. I learned how they spoke about service workers when they thought no one important was listening. And most painfully, I learned how little they actually valued me beyond what I could provide for their image and their inheritance. But tonight, at the Harrington Children's Hospital Gala, in the very house where I had been scrubbing baseboards just yesterday, all of that was about to change. Because tonight, they were about to discover that their embarrassing cleaning lady mother had just donated $5 million to build the new pediatric wing they were celebrating. And this was only the beginning of what they were about to learn about the woman they had been too ashamed to call their mother in public. The story of how I became Miranda Arlington begins 43 years ago in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above Clyde's Corner Market, where my father Hector worked 16-hour days just to keep food on our table. My maiden name was Miranda Price, and I learned the value of hard work by watching my parents sacrifice everything for their children's future. When I met Arthur Arlington at the State University, I was working 3 jobs to pay for my business degree, cleaning offices at night, tutoring struggling students, and serving coffee at the campus cafe where Arthur would sit for hours, sketching building designs on napkins. He was studying architecture, dreaming of transforming skylines, while I was studying finance, determined to never watch my parents struggle with money again. Arthur fell in love with my ambition before he ever noticed my looks. On our 3rd date, he told me his biggest fear wasn't failing in business. It was becoming the kind of wealthy person who forgot where they came from. "Promise me something, Miranda," he had said that night as we walked through the university gardens. "If we ever make it big, if we ever have more money than we need, promise me we'll remember what it feels like to work for every dollar. Promise me we'll teach our children the value of earning respect through character, not inheritance." I promised him that night, never knowing how prophetic those words would become. We married after graduation and started Arlington Development with a $10,000 loan from my father's retirement fund. Arthur designed affordable housing complexes while I managed the books, negotiated contracts, and slowly built our reputation in the real estate world. We worked 18-hour days side by side, living on ramen noodles and shared dreams. Carrie was born in year 3 of our business, and Daniel followed 2 years later. Even as our company grew and our bank account swelled, we kept them grounded. They had chores, earned their allowances, and understood that luxury was a privilege, not a right. Arthur's breakthrough came when he designed the revolutionary Riverside Commons, a mixed-income housing development that won national architecture awards and changed how cities approached affordable housing. Suddenly, everyone wanted an Arthur Arlington building. Our company exploded from a small family business to a multi-million-dollar empire almost overnight. But we stayed true to our promise. The children still did their own laundry, still worked summer jobs, still understood that wealth was a responsibility, not just an advantage. When Arthur was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at 58, his first concern wasn't for himself. It was for our family's future. "The money will change them, Miranda," he whispered during one of his final lucid moments. "Not right away, but eventually. Wealth has a way of insulating people from reality, from empathy. You have to find a way to keep them connected to who they really are." I held his hand, promising him I would protect our children's character as fiercely as I would protect their inheritance. Arthur passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind a business empire worth hundreds of millions and two adult children who suddenly found themselves heirs to more money than they had ever imagined.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The change wasn't immediate. For the first few years after Arthur's death, Carrie and Daniel seemed to honor their father's memory. Carrie started her own real estate company, refusing to simply join Arlington Development. Daniel worked his way through law school and took a position at a modest firm determined to build his own reputation. I was proud of them. I thought Arthur's lessons had taken root. Then, Carrie married Gabe Harrington, a social climber from old money who whispered poison in her ear about maintaining appropriate social standing. Daniel began dating Elisa's mother, a woman who measured worth by zip codes and designer labels. Slowly, I watched my children transform from the grounded, hard-working people Arthur and I had raised into image-conscious social climbers who cringed when I mentioned my working-class roots or showed up to their events without a designer handbag. The breaking point came during Elisa's 13th birthday party. I had arrived at Carrie's house in my comfortable Honda instead of the luxury car she thought I should drive. When one of the other mothers asked what I drove, Carrie actually lied, claiming I was between cars, rather than admit I chose practicality over prestige. That's when I realized my children had become everything Arthur and I had feared, people who valued appearance over authenticity, status over substance. The bullying incident with Elise was just the final straw. When my own granddaughter was being tormented because her family's wealth made her a target, and my children's solution was to ask me to become smaller, less visible, less myself, I knew something drastic had to be done. I had spent 3 decades building a fortune, not for the money itself, but for the security and opportunities it could provide my family. But what good was financial security if it came at the cost of their moral security? What good were opportunities if they couldn't see the opportunities they were squandering to be decent human beings? So I devised a test, not a cruel test, but a necessary one.
I would become the thing they seemed most ashamed of, a working-class woman who cleaned houses for a living. I would see how they treated me when they thought I had nothing to offer their social standing. I would discover whether the children Arthur and I had raised with such love and intention still existed somewhere beneath the layers of privilege and pretense. For 3 years, I scrubbed the toilets of their former neighbors while living on my supposed cleaning salary. I watched my children make excuses for my absence at important events. I listened to them explain to their friends that their mother was going through a difficult phase or finding herself after their father's death. Never once did they ask if I was happy. Never once did they inquire whether I felt fulfilled or safe or financially secure. Their only concern was how my choices reflected on them. But tonight, in the Harrington mansion, where I had been invisible just 24 hours ago, they were about to learn the truth about the woman they had been too embarrassed to acknowledge in public. The transformation from Miranda Arlington to Miranda Clyde wasn't just about changing my address and taking a job. It required rebuilding my entire identity from the ground up. I spent weeks studying how to become invisible in plain sight, learning the subtle art of being overlooked by the very social class I had once belonged to. My first day at Premier House Services was both terrifying and liberating. The company's headquarters sat in a modest strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, a world away from the gleaming corporate towers where I had once held board meetings. When I walked through the door in my carefully chosen second-hand clothes, clean but clearly inexpensive, I felt like an actor stepping onto a stage. Mrs. Clyde, the manager, a no-nonsense woman named Helen, greeted me with a firm handshake. "Your references check out beautifully. Mrs. Patterson from Elmwood Drive gave you glowing reviews for your housekeeping work." I smiled, knowing that Mrs. Patterson was actually my longtime friend Margaret, who had agreed to help with my elaborate charade. Margaret understood what I was trying to accomplish, even if she thought I was taking things too far. "I appreciate the opportunity," I replied, my voice carrying just the right note of grateful humility. "I really need this job." And in a strange way, that was true.
I did need this job, not for the money, but for the truth it would reveal about my family. Helen handed me a uniform, a simple gray dress with Premier House Services embroidered on the pocket. You'll start with the Harrington estate tomorrow. It's one of our most prestigious accounts. Mrs. Harrington is particular about her standards. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Harrington estate belonged to Gabe's parents, my son-in-law's family home where I had attended numerous dinner parties as an honored guest. Now I would be returning as the help, invisible and ignored. That first morning, I stood outside the imposing iron gates of 1247 Willowbrook Heights Drive, my heart pounding as I pressed the service entrance buzzer. The house was exactly as I remembered, a Georgian mansion with pristine gardens and marble columns that screamed old money sophistication. "Service entrance is around back," crackled a voice through the intercom, not bothering to ask who I was. To them, I was just another uniformed worker, as interchangeable and forgettable as the gardener or the pool cleaner. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington met me in the servants' hallway, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her cold blue eyes scanning me like she was inspecting a piece of furniture. "You must be the new girl," she said, her tone making it clear that girl was how she saw all domestic help, regardless of age. I trust Helen explained our expectations. We maintain the highest standards in this household. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my eyes respectfully lowered. It was a strange sensation, being looked through rather than at by someone who had shared dinner conversation with me dozens of times over the past 5 years. She handed me a detailed list of tasks, room by room, with specific instructions about which cleaning products to use on which surfaces. The family quarters are off-limits unless specifically requested. You'll focus on the main entertaining areas, guest bathrooms, and the kitchen. We're hosting the hospital board meeting next week, so everything must be absolutely spotless. My breath caught. The hospital board meeting where I was supposed to be presenting the quarterly financial report as one of the major donors. Now I would be the one polishing the conference table where I should have been sitting. The work was harder than I had anticipated. Not physically, I had always been active and capable, but emotionally. Every surface I cleaned, every floor I mopped, every toilet I scrubbed represented a choice to remain invisible while my family lived their lives ashamed of the woman they thought I had become. The worst part was overhearing the casual conversations of the wealthy homeowners who discussed their help as if we were deaf. I learned intimate details about their marriages, their business dealings, their petty social rivalries, all while they treated me like a piece of furniture that happened to move around and clean things. But it was at the Morrison estate, my third assignment, where I had my first real shock about how my own children viewed people like the person they thought I had become. I was dusting the living room mantel when Carrie arrived for what I later learned was a business lunch with Patricia Morrison. They were discussing a property deal, and I was so focused on being invisible that they began talking freely about their personal lives.
"I still can't believe your mother took that job," Patricia said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It must be so embarrassing for you and Danielle. I mean, cleaning houses at her age? What will people think?" Carrie's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Trust me, we've tried talking to her, but she's being stubborn about it. Claims she needs the money, which is ridiculous. Dad left her plenty. I think she's having some kind of breakdown and doesn't want to admit it." "Have you considered intervention or maybe therapy?" Patricia suggested. "I mean, it's one thing to go through a difficult adjustment period, but this is affecting your whole family's reputation." "The worst part," Carrie continued, "is that she seems almost proud of it. Like she thinks there's something noble about scrubbing other people's toilets. It's humiliating. Gabe's parents keep asking questions, and I don't know what to tell them." I froze with my dust cloth in hand, my heart breaking as I listened to my daughter discuss me like I was a family embarrassment that needed to be managed rather than a human being who deserved respect regardless of my occupation. That's when I truly understood what this experiment was revealing. My children weren't just ashamed of my job, they were ashamed of me. They couldn't see past the uniform to the person wearing it,
couldn't imagine that someone they loved might find dignity and purpose in honest work. As I continued my duties that day, I made a decision. This test would continue until they learned to see me, really see me, not as an extension of their social status, but as their mother who deserved their love and respect no matter what. The catalyst came on a rainy Thursday afternoon at the Wellington estate, where I had been assigned to prepare for their annual autumn charity luncheon. I was in the kitchen, polishing silver serving pieces, when I heard familiar voices echoing through the marble foyer. My heart sank as I recognized Carrie's laugh mingling with the hostess's greeting. "Carrie, darling, so wonderful you could make it, and you brought Elise. How lovely!" I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, hoping to remain unnoticed. Through the service window, I could see my daughter and granddaughter being welcomed into the elegant dining room, where 20 of the city's most prominent women were gathering for their monthly charity committee meeting. Elise had grown so much in the past year. At 16, she was becoming a beautiful young woman, with her grandfather Arthur's kind eyes and her mother's determined chin. But as I watched her navigate the room of wealthy socialites, I could see the careful calculation in her movements, the practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Ladies," Mrs. Wellington called for attention, "I'd like to introduce Carrie Harrington and her daughter Elise. Carrie's been instrumental in finding us the perfect venue for our spring gala." The women offered polite applause and welcoming murmurs. I should have retreated to the pantry, should have made myself invisible, as I had trained myself to do, but something kept me frozen in place, watching my family navigate the social waters I had once swum in so easily. That's when I heard Mrs. Patricia Morrison's voice cut through the pleasantries. "Carrie, dear, how is your mother doing? I heard she's been having some difficulties adjusting since Arthur's passing." The room grew quieter, the kind of anticipatory hush that descends when gossip is about to be served alongside the cucumber sandwiches. I watched Carrie's face tighten, saw her force that practiced smile wider. "Mother is finding her way," Carrie replied carefully. "Everyone grieves differently." Of course, Mrs. Morrison continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But Helen from Premier House Services mentioned she's been working for them, cleaning houses, if you can imagine. At her age, with her background, it must be so difficult for your family." I gripped the silver tray so tightly my knuckles went white. Around the room, I could see the other women leaning forward slightly, hungry for details about the fallen social queen who had descended to scrubbing floors. "I mean," Mrs. Morrison pressed on, "I understand the need to stay busy after losing a spouse, but surely there were more appropriate ways for someone of Miranda's former standing to occupy her time. Volunteering at the museum, perhaps, or joining a book club?" Elise was staring at her mother, her young face pale with mortification. I could see the teenager wrestling with the shame of having a grandmother who worked as the help, while surrounded by girls whose grandmothers hosted charity galas and served on hospital boards. That's when Carrie made the choice that shattered my heart completely. "To be perfectly honest," she said, her voice carrying across the room with crystalline clarity, "we're as baffled by her choices as you are. Daniel and I have tried to talk sense into her, but she seems determined to embarrass herself, and frankly, all of us, with this cleaning obsession." The women need sympathetic noises, but I could see the gleeful speculation in their eyes. Here was Miranda Arlington's own daughter throwing her mother under the social bus to preserve her own standing. "The worst part," Carrie continued, warming to her theme, "is that she actually seems proud of it. She talks about honest work and earning her keep, as if she hasn't spent the last 30 years contributing to this community in meaningful ways. It's like she's forgotten who she is, who she was married to, what our family represents." Mrs. Wellington nodded sagely. "Grief can manifest in such unusual ways. Perhaps professional help?" "We've suggested it," Carrie lied smoothly, "but you know how stubborn she can be. We're hoping this phase will pass before it does any to family relationships." I watched my granddaughter's face crumble with shame. Elise was staring at her hands, clearly wishing she could disappear into the expensive upholstery. This was the moment I realized that my experiment had gone beyond testing my children's character. It was actively harming my granddaughter, who was being forced to carry the weight of her family's embarrassment. At least she's working for a reputable service, Mrs. Morrison offered. Premier House Services only places their people in the best homes. I'm sure she's not causing any actual problems. That's when Elise spoke up, her young voice sharp with pain and anger. "She's not causing problems," she said, lifting her chin with a defiance that reminded me of Arthur. "Grandma Miranda works harder than any of you realize, and she's still the smartest, kindest person I know, even if you can't see past her uniform." The room fell silent. Carrie's face flushed deep red as every woman in the room stared at her daughter, who had just defended the family member they were all busy pitying and dismissing. "Elise," Carrie hissed under her breath, "that's enough." But Elise was just getting started. "No, Mom, it's not enough. You're all sitting here in your expensive clothes, talking about Grandma like she's lost her mind because she chose to work an honest job. But none of you have ever done an honest day's work in your lives. You just spend your husband's money and pretend that makes you important." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Wellington's mouth had actually fallen open. Mrs. Morrison looked like she'd been slapped. And Carrie looked like she wanted to crawl under the antique Persian rug. From my hiding place in the kitchen, I felt my heart soar with pride, even as it broke with sorrow. My granddaughter had just defended me with more courage and conviction than my own children had shown in 3 years. But I also realized that I had pushed this charade too far. Elise was paying the price for my experiment in human nature, and that was unacceptable. As the uncomfortable silence stretched on, I made my decision. It was time to end this test. It was time for Miranda Arlington to reclaim her place in the world, not for my sake, but for Elise's. The charity gala at the Harrington estate was just 3 days away. It would be the perfect stage for my revelation. That evening, I sat in my modest Maple Grove kitchen with a cup of tea and my father's old leather notebook, the same one where he had meticulously planned every business decision for Clyde's Corner Market. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, worth $50 million, planning my next move at a scratched Formica table under fluorescent lighting, just as my working-class father had done decades ago. The first call I made was to Margaret Patterson, my oldest friend and the only person who knew the full truth about my 3-year charade. "Miranda, thank God." Margaret's voice was filled with relief when she answered. "I've been worried sick since you called this afternoon. You sounded so upset." "I witnessed something today that changed everything," I said, pulling my notebook toward me. "My granddaughter defended me with more integrity than my own children have shown in 3 years. She's paying the price for my experiment, Margaret, and I can't let that continue." Margaret sighed deeply. "Honey, I've been telling you for months that this had gone too far. What are you planning?" I flipped open the notebook to a fresh page and began writing. "The Harrington Charity Gala is this Saturday. It's the perfect opportunity. All the right people will be there, including Carrie and Daniel. But I need your help to make this work." For the next hour, Margaret and I crafted a plan that would require precision timing and absolute secrecy. Margaret would contact the hospital board chairman, Dr. Richard Stevenson, and arrange for a special announcement during the gala. She would also coordinate with my financial advisor to prepare the necessary documentation. My second call was to Helen at Premier House Services. "Miranda, dear, is everything all right?" Helen's voice carried genuine concern. "You never call in the evening." "I need a favor, Helen, and I'll understand if you can't accommodate it," I said carefully. "I'd like to be assigned to work the Harrington Gala this Saturday. I know it's not typical for cleaning staff to work events, but they'll need extra help with the preparation and cleanup." Helen was quiet for a moment. "That's unusual. The Harringtons typically use catering staff for events. Why would you want to work such a demanding assignment?" Personal reasons, I replied. Let's just say I have some unfinished business there. Helen agreed, though I could hear the confusion in her voice. She had no way of knowing that she was helping orchestrate the most dramatic revelation of her career. The next morning, I drove to the bank in the next town over, where I maintained my private accounts under my maiden name, Miranda Price. My financial advisor, James Chen, had been managing my investments with discretion for 3 years, believing I was simply a wealthy widow who preferred privacy. "Mrs. Price," James greeted me with professional warmth, "Margaret Patterson called ahead. She mentioned you needed some special arrangements." I nodded, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "I need you to prepare documentation showing that Miranda Price and Miranda Arlington are the same person. I also need a cashier's check made out to Willowbrook Children's Hospital for $5 million, dated for this Saturday." James's eyebrows rose slightly, but his professionalism kept him from asking questions. "Of course. May I ask the occasion?" "Let's call it a family reunion," I said, with a smile that held 3 years' worth of secrets. That afternoon, I visited the one person whose opinion mattered most in this entire situation, my granddaughter Elise. I found her at the local coffee shop where she worked part-time, a job she had taken despite her parents' protests that Harrington children don't need to work. She was behind the counter, her face still showing traces of yesterday's embarrassment when she spotted me walking through the door. "Grandma," she called out, her face lighting up for the first time in months. She quickly finished with her customer and hurried over to hug me. "I'm so glad you're here. I need to apologize for yesterday." "Apologize?" I asked, holding her at arm's length to look into her earnest young face. "Sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for." "But I embarrassed Mom in front of all those women. I said things I probably shouldn't have said about their work ethic." She bit her lip, a gesture that reminded me so much of Arthur when he was wrestling with a difficult decision. I guided her to a quiet corner table, away from the afternoon rush of customers. "Elise, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Yesterday, you stood up for someone you love when it wasn't easy or popular to do so. That takes courage, and I'm proud of you for having your grandfather's backbone." Her eyes filled with tears. "But Mom was so angry, and Dad said I need to learn when to keep my opinions to myself. They think I don't understand how hard this has been for them, having you work as a cleaner." "And what do you think?" I asked gently. Elise straightened her shoulders, that familiar Arlington determination shining through. "I think you're the bravest person I know. I don't care if you clean houses or run companies or dig ditches. You're still my grandma, and you still give the best hugs and make the best chocolate chip cookies in the world." I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "There are some things about your grandmother that you don't know yet, sweetheart. Some surprises that might help you understand why these past 3 years happened the way they did." She tilted her head curiously. "What kind of surprises?" "The kind that will be revealed at the charity gala on Saturday night," I said, squeezing her hands. "Will you be there?" "Mom said I have to go. Something about family obligations and community involvement." She rolled her eyes in typical teenage fashion. "Good, because Saturday night, you're going to see a side of your family and your grandmother that might surprise everyone." Friday evening arrived with an autumn chill that seemed to seep into my bones as I stood in my modest bedroom staring at the 2 outfits laid out on my bed. On the left was my familiar gray Premier House Services uniform, freshly pressed and ready for what everyone believed would be another night of invisible service. On the right was a midnight blue evening gown I had purchased that afternoon. Elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of dress that commanded quiet respect without screaming for attention. Tomorrow night, I would wear both. The phone rang, startling me from my contemplation. Daniel's name flashed on the caller ID, and I felt my stomach clench. We hadn't spoken in over 2 weeks, not since our last awkward family dinner, where he had spent the entire evening checking his phone and making polite conversation that felt more like an obligation than affection. "Hi, Daniel," I answered, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Mom, hi. Listen, about tomorrow night." He paused, and I could hear the familiar sound of him loosening his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed in law school. Carrie and I have been talking, and we think it might be best if you didn't attend the gala. My heart clenched, even though I had been expecting something like this. Oh, and why is that? It's just, well, you'll be working there anyway, right? With the cleaning service? And we'll be there with clients and colleagues, and it might be complicated. Complicated. There was that word again. The diplomatic way my children had learned to say embarrassing without actually admitting their shame. I see, I said quietly. And what did you tell people about why I won't be seated with the family? Daniel's silence stretched long enough that I could picture him running his hair through his hair, another stress tell. We said you weren't feeling well, seasonal flu or something. Of course you did. I sat down heavily on my bed, the evening gown crinkling beneath me. Daniel, let me ask you something. When you think about your father, what do you remember most about him? Mom, I don't think this is the time for... Humor me. Another pause. Then, reluctantly, I remember how he treated everyone the same. The construction workers, the city council members, the bank presidents. He talked to everyone like they mattered. And why do you think he did that? Because Daniel's voice grew softer, more thoughtful. Because he said character wasn't about who you impressed, but about who you bothered to notice. Your father would have been proud of Elise yesterday, I said gently. She stood up for someone when it wasn't socially convenient. She noticed someone who others were content to dismiss. Elise was out of line, Mom. She embarrassed Carrie in front of some very important women. Important how, Daniel? Important because of what they've accomplished, or important because of who they married? The question hung in the air between us. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him struggling with concepts he had once understood instinctively, but had somehow forgotten along the way. I have to go, he said finally. Sarah's calling me for dinner. We'll see you next week, okay? After he hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my bedroom, thinking about the man Daniel used to be. The boy who had spent his summers volunteering at the community center, who had insisted on earning money for his first car rather than simply asking us to buy one. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been replaced by a man who measured worth by social standing and saw his own mother as a liability to his carefully constructed image. The doorbell rang, interrupting my melancholy. Through the peephole, I saw Margaret standing on my porch, holding what appeared to be a bottle of wine and a manila envelope. I brought reinforcements, she announced when I opened the door, holding up the wine. And the final documents from James Chen. She handed me the envelope with a conspiratorial smile. Everything you need for tomorrow night's performance. We settled in my small living room with glasses of Margaret's excellent Pinot Noir, and I opened the envelope to review the contents. The hospital donation documentation, proof of my various charitable contributions over the past 3 years, and, most importantly, the legal papers establishing my true identity and financial holdings. Are you nervous? Margaret asked, studying my face in the lamplight. Terrified, I admitted. Not about the money or the revelation, about what comes after. Once I do this, there's no going back to the way things were. My relationship with Carrie and Daniel will either heal or break completely. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. Miranda, those relationships are already broken, have been for 3 years. Your children have been treating you like an embarrassment while you've been supporting hospital wings and scholarship funds. They don't even know who you really are anymore. But what if they can't forgive me for the deception? What if they see this as some elaborate manipulation? Then they'll prove they've learned nothing from Arthur's example, Margaret said firmly. Honey, you gave them 3 years to show you who they really were when they thought you had nothing to offer their social status. Tomorrow night, they get to find out who you really are. I nodded, taking a sip of wine and feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. Will you be there tomorrow? Wouldn't miss it for the world. I've got a front row seat to watch Miranda Arlington reclaim her throne. She grinned wickedly. Plus, someone needs to document the looks on your children's faces when they realize their embarrassing cleaning lady mother just donated more money to charity than they'll earn in their lifetimes. As Margaret left, I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the modest neighborhood that had become my sanctuary for 3 years. Tomorrow night, I would step back into a world of wealth and privilege, but I would carry with me the lessons I had learned here about dignity, about honest work, and about the difference between being truly valued and being socially useful. The game was almost over. Tomorrow, all the pieces would finally be revealed. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed to match the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I had barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing what I would say and how I would say it. By 7 a.m., I was dressed in my cleaning uniform, ready to begin what would be my final day as the invisible Miranda Clyde. The Harrington estate was a flurry of activity when I arrived. Catering trucks lined the circular drive, florists were arranging massive centerpieces in the foyer, and event planners barked orders into their headsets. I slipped through the service entrance, just another uniformed worker preparing for the evening's grand affair. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington met me in the kitchen, her silver hair already styled for the evening, despite the early hour. "Miranda," she said briskly, consulting her clipboard, "I need you to focus on the guest bathrooms and the library today. We're expecting over 200 people tonight, including some very important board members from the hospital. Everything must be absolutely perfect." "Of course, Mrs. Harrington," I replied, accepting the list of tasks. As she walked away, I wondered what she would think when she learned that one of those important board members had been scrubbing her toilets for the past 6 months. Around noon, as I was polishing the mahogany bookshelves in the library, I heard familiar voices approaching from the hallway. My heart sank as I recognized Carrie and Gabe discussing the event's arrangements. "Mother better not cause any scenes tonight," Carrie was saying as they entered the library. "I still can't believe what Elise said at Patricia's luncheon. The gossip is already starting to spread." I kept my head down, focusing intently on the leather-bound volumes, willing myself to become invisible as I had practiced for 3 years. Gabe settled into one of the leather armchairs, barely glancing in my direction. "Maybe it's time for a more serious intervention. My parents know an excellent psychiatrist who specializes in geriatric depression and adjustment disorders." "You think Mom needs psychiatric help?" Carrie asked, genuine worry creeping into her voice. "Think about it rationally," Gabe replied, his tone patronizing. "A wealthy widow with no financial pressures suddenly decides to scrub floors for minimum wage? That's not normal behavior, Carrie. There's clearly something wrong with her mental state." I gripped my dust cloth tighter, fighting the urge to turn around and tell them exactly what was wrong with my mental state. I had raised children who could discuss committing their mother to psychiatric care while standing 3 feet away from her. "Maybe you're right," Carrie said slowly. "Daniel thinks so too. We've been too gentle with her, too respectful of what we thought was her grieving process. But 3 years is long enough." "After tonight's gala, we'll sit her down for a serious family meeting," Gabe continued. "Present a united front. Either she agrees to get help or we'll have to consider legal options for her own protection." Legal options. They were discussing having me declared mentally incompetent, stripping away my autonomy and decision-making power, all while I stood there polishing their books. "What about Elise?" Carrie asked. "She's been defending her grandmother's choices." "Elise is 16, Gabe said dismissively. "She doesn't understand the broader implications. Once Miranda gets the help she needs, Elise will see that we were acting in everyone's best interests." They left the library discussing logistics for their intervention, completely unaware that the woman they were planning to have declared mentally unstable had been listening to every word while managing a $50 million portfolio in her spare time. I finished my cleaning in a daze, my hands moving automatically while my mind reeled. They weren't just ashamed of my job, they genuinely believed I had lost my mind. In their worldview, no rational person would choose honest work over idle luxury, would choose authenticity over social status. The afternoon brought another devastating conversation, this time between Daniel and his wife Sarah, whom I encountered in the guest powder room I was cleaning. "I feel terrible about Daniel's mother," Sarah was saying as she touched up her lipstick in the mirror. "She used to be such a vital, intelligent woman. Now look at her, reduced to cleaning other people's houses. It's heartbreaking." "Daniel blames himself," came Daniel's voice from the hallway. "He thinks we should have been more involved after Dad died, should have recognized the signs of her decline earlier." "Well, you're involved now," Sarah replied. "Getting her professional help is the loving thing to do, even if she doesn't see it that way initially." "I just hope she'll forgive us eventually," Daniel said sadly. "When she's better, when she's thinking clearly again, I hope she'll understand that everything we're doing comes from love." I stood frozen behind the bathroom door, listening to my son discuss me with such genuine sadness and misplaced compassion. He truly believed he was losing his mother to mental illness, that the woman who had raised him with such care and intention had somehow disappeared into delusion. For a moment, I almost reconsidered my plan. These weren't heartless social climbers plotting against me. These were confused adult children who thought they were watching their mother's mental deterioration. Their shame wasn't malicious, it was protective. But then I remembered Elisa's brave defense at the charity luncheon, the way she had stood up for my dignity when her own parents couldn't. I remembered 3 years of being treated as an embarrassment, 3 years of watching my children value appearance over substance. They needed to learn the same lesson Arthur had tried to teach them years ago, that a person's worth isn't determined by their job title or social status, but by their character and choices. And sometimes, the most important lessons can only be learned through shock and revelation. Tonight, they would discover that their mentally unstable mother had been completely lucid all along, lucid enough to continue her charitable work in secret, lucid enough to manage her investments wisely, and lucid enough to see exactly who they had become when they thought no one important was watching. The final act was about to begin. The transformation began at 6 p.m. in the servants' quarters bathroom of the Harrington estate. I stared at my reflection in the small mirror above the utilitarian sink. Miranda Clyde, house cleaner, invisible and overlooked. In 2 hours, I would shed this identity forever. But first, I had one final role to play. The gala guests began arriving at 7, their expensive cars creating a parade of wealth along Willowbrook Heights Drive. I moved through the mansion like a ghost, collecting discarded cocktail napkins and emptying ashtrays, watching the social elite of our city mingle and air-kiss their way through another charitable obligation. From the service hallway, I observed my children work the room with practiced ease. Carrie, stunning in emerald silk, laughed at appropriate moments while networking with potential real estate clients. Daniel, distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, discussed legal precedents with fellow attorneys between sips of premium champagne. They belonged here, in this world of privilege and influence, and they had systematically excluded their own mother from it. At 8:15, I spotted Elise near the dessert table, looking beautiful but uncomfortable in a formal navy dress that was probably her mother's choice rather than her own. She kept glancing toward the kitchen door, and I realized with a pang that she was looking for me, the grandmother her parents had forbidden from attending as a guest. Margaret caught my eye from across the room, resplendent in burgundy velvet, and gave me a subtle nod. Everything was in place. Dr. Stevenson had been briefed, the surprise announcement was prepared, and my evening gown hung ready in the coat closet where Margaret had secretly placed it an hour earlier. At exactly 8:30, I slipped away from the party and made my way to the ground floor powder room that the caterers weren't using. My hands shook slightly as I changed clothes, trading my gray uniform for the midnight blue evening gown. I had practiced this transformation dozens of times, but now, with the moment finally here, I felt like an actress stepping onto the stage for the performance of her lifetime. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was neither Miranda Clyde nor the old Miranda Arlington. She was someone new, someone who had learned the value of honest work without losing the confidence that came from financial security, someone who understood both sides of the social divide that split our city into the served and the servants. I applied lipstick with steady hands, pinned my hair into an elegant updo, and fastened the pearl necklace Arthur had given me for our 20th anniversary. Then I took a deep breath and walked toward the main staircase, where Margaret was waiting with a knowing smile. "Ready for this?" she whispered as we linked arms. As ready as someone can be for completely upending their family's understanding of reality, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. We entered the main ballroom just as Dr. Stevenson was taking the podium to begin the evening's formal program. The crowd gradually quieted, champagne glasses pausing midway to lips as attention focused on the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Stevenson began, his voice carrying easily across the elegant space. "Before we begin tonight's program, celebrating the new pediatric wing at Willowbrook Children's Hospital, I have a very special announcement to make." I positioned myself at the back of the room, scanning the crowd until I found my family. Carrie and Gabe stood near the fireplace, Daniel and Sarah by the French doors leading to the terrace. Elise had moved closer to the front, her young face turned attentively toward the speaker. "Tonight, we have the honor of recognizing our most generous benefactor," Dr. Stevenson continued, "someone whose extraordinary gift has made our new wing possible. This individual has chosen to make their contribution anonymously until now, but has agreed to step forward tonight to help us properly thank them." I began walking slowly toward the front of the room, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. A few heads turned my way, faces showing polite curiosity about the unfamiliar woman moving through their midst. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Mrs. Miranda Arlington, whose $5 million donation has funded the entire Miranda Arlington Pediatric Care Wing." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and confused whispers. I saw heads swiveling, people looking around for someone they recognized, expecting to see a familiar society matron step forward to accept the recognition. Instead, they saw me, walking steadily toward the podium with quiet dignity, my chin held high, and my eyes focused on the 3 family members whose faces had gone completely white with shock. Carrie's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a spray of crystal and golden liquid. Daniel's mouth actually fell open, his usual professional composure completely abandoned. And Elise, beautiful, brave Elise, began to smile with dawning understanding and pure, undiluted pride. Dr. Stevenson extended his hand to help me onto the small platform beside the podium. "Mrs. Arlington, thank you for your extraordinary generosity and for joining us tonight." I accepted the microphone he offered, looking out over a sea of faces that ranged from confused to curious to completely stunned. But my eyes kept returning to my family, to the children who had spent 3 years being ashamed of a woman they had never really known. "Thank you, Dr. Stevenson," I began, my voice steady and clear. "And thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate something that matters far more than social status or professional achievement, the health and well-being of our community's children." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room one more time before settling on Carrie and Daniel. Some of you may be wondering how a woman who works as a house cleaner could afford such a donation. The answer to that question is about to surprise a few people in this room almost as much as it surprised me to learn what my own family really thought of honest work. The silence in the ballroom was so complete I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 200 of the city's most prominent citizens stood frozen, champagne glasses suspended in midair, as they processed what I had just revealed. 3 years ago, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd, I made a choice that some people in this room thought was evidence of mental instability. I chose to work as a house cleaner, not out of financial necessity, but to understand something that had been troubling me about our community, about how we treat people based on what we assume about their worth. My eyes found Carrie first. She was gripping Gabe's arms so tightly her knuckles were white, her face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning horror as she realized the implications of my words. For 3 years, I've cleaned the homes of many people in this room. I've been invisible to some of you, treated kindly by others, and dismissed entirely by a few. But the most heartbreaking discovery wasn't how strangers treated the woman they thought was just a cleaner. It was how my own family responded when they believed I had fallen from grace. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his lawyer's instincts kicking in even in his shocked state. "Mom, what are you saying?" I smiled at him, the same gentle smile I'd given him as a child when he needed to face the consequences of his choices. "I'm saying, Daniel, that the woman you and your sister have been too embarrassed to acknowledge in public for 3 years, the woman you are planning to have declared mentally incompetent after tonight's gala, has been quietly managing a $50 million portfolio while scrubbing the toilets of your former neighbors." The silence in the ballroom was so complete I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 200 of the city's most prominent citizens stood frozen, champagne glasses suspended in midair, as they processed what I had just revealed. 3 years ago, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd, I made a choice that some people in this room thought was evidence of mental instability. I chose to work as a house cleaner, not out of financial necessity, but to understand something that had been troubling me about our community, about how we treat people based on what we assume about their worth. My eyes found Carrie first. She was gripping Gabe's arms so tightly her knuckles were white, her face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning horror as she realized the implications of my words. For 3 years, I've cleaned the homes of many people in this room. I've been invisible to some of you, treated kindly by others, and dismissed entirely by a few. But the most heartbreaking discovery wasn't how strangers treated the woman they thought was just a cleaner. It was how my own family responded when they believed I had fallen from grace. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his lawyer's instincts kicking in even in his shocked state. "Mom, what are you saying?" I smiled at him, the same gentle smile I'd given him as a child when he needed to face the consequences of his choices. "I'm saying, Daniel, that the woman you and your sister have been too embarrassed to acknowledge in public for 3 years, the woman you were planning to have declared mentally incompetent after tonight's gala, has been quietly managing a $50 million portfolio while scrubbing the toilets of your former neighbors."
The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington actually swayed on her feet, perhaps remembering every dismissive interaction she'd had with her cleaning lady over the past 6 months. "Mrs. Arlington," Dr. Stevenson stepped closer to the microphone, his voice carefully controlled. "Are you telling us that you've been working incognito as domestic help while simultaneously serving as one of our hospital's major donors?" "Among other charitable activities, yes," I confirmed. The Miranda Arlington Scholarship Fund at State University has put 47 first-generation college students through school. The Arlington Community Center in Maple Grove provides after-school programs for working families. And the anonymous donations to various social services throughout the city, well, they weren't quite as anonymous as everyone believed. I turned back to my children, who stood like statues in their formal wear, their faces reflecting 3 years' worth of assumptions crumbling in real time. "Carrie, Daniel, would you join me up here, please?" It wasn't really a request. The entire room was watching, waiting to see how this family drama would unfold. My children had no choice but to approach the podium, their movements stiff and mechanical. As they climbed the steps to join me, I could see the questions, accusations, and hurt swirling in their eyes. But first, they had to face the truth about who they had become when they thought their mother had nothing left to offer their carefully constructed social status.
The real confrontation was about to begin. The aftermath of my revelation rippled through the ballroom like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations resumed in urgent whispers as guests processed what they had witnessed. Miranda Arlington, society matron turned secret house cleaner, had just exposed her own children's shame in the most public way possible. Carrie and Daniel stood beside me on the platform, their faces pale and stricken, as Dr. Stevenson gracefully concluded the formal portion of the evening. But I could see in their eyes that the real reckoning was just beginning. "We need to talk," Daniel said quietly as the crowd began to disperse, privately. I nodded toward the library, where I had overheard their intervention plans just hours earlier. Of course. The walk through the mansion felt surreal. Past the bathroom, where I had scrubbed toilets that morning, through the kitchen, where I had been dismissed as hired help, into the library, where I had been invisible while they planned my psychiatric evaluation. Elise appeared in the doorway just as we settled into the leather chairs. "I'm not leaving," she announced, her voice carrying Arthur's stubborn determination. "Whatever you're going to say to Grandma, I have a right to hear it." Carrie looked ready to protest, but I held up my hand. "She stays. She's the only one who defended me when it wasn't convenient or profitable." The silence stretched uncomfortably before Daniel finally spoke, his lawyer's composure cracking. 3 years, Mom. 3 years you let us believe you were having some kind of breakdown. Do you have any idea what that did to us?" "What it did to you," I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "Daniel, you spent those 3 years planning to have me committed rather than asking if I was happy." "Because we thought you were sick," Carrie burst out, tears streaming down her face. "We thought we were losing you, that grief had broken something in your mind. How were we supposed to know you were conducting some elaborate social experiment?" I leaned forward, studying both their faces. "It wasn't an experiment, sweetheart. It was a test, and I'm afraid you both failed it rather spectacularly." "That's not fair," Daniel protested. "We were trying to protect you." "From what? From honest work? From being associated with people you consider beneath your social status?" I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden where Arthur and I had once walked, planning our future. "Your father and I built our wealth from nothing, working side by side. We taught you that dignity comes from character, not from bank balances. But somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons." Elise spoke up from her corner chair, her young voice cutting through the tension. "They weren't protecting you, Grandma. They were protecting themselves from being embarrassed by you." Carrie whirled on her daughter. "Elise, that's enough." "No, Mom, it's not enough." Elise stood up, facing her parents with fierce determination. "For 3 years, you've made excuses for why Grandma couldn't come to my school events, why she couldn't join us for family dinners at restaurants, why she had to be hidden away like some shameful secret. You weren't worried about her mental health, you were worried about what people would think." The truth hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. My children had failed the most basic test of love. They had not valued me when they thought I had nothing to offer their ambitions. But as I looked at their stricken faces, I saw something else beginning to emerge, the painful recognition of who they had become, and perhaps the first stirrings of genuine remorse. The question now was whether they were capable of change, or if 3 years of shallow values had calcified into their permanent characters. The silence in the library stretched for long minutes, broken only by the distant sound of guests departing and caterers cleaning up. Carrie sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Daniel stared out the window, his jaw working as he processed the magnitude of what had been revealed. Finally, Carrie looked up, her makeup streaked, but her eyes clearer than I had seen them in years. "I need to know something, Mom. When you overheard us planning the intervention today, how did that make you feel?" It was the first time in 3 years that either of my children had asked about my feelings rather than assuming they knew what was best for me. Heartbroken, I answered honestly. Not because you thought I needed help, but because in 3 years, neither of you had ever simply asked if I was happy. You assumed mental illness was more likely than the possibility that I had made a conscious choice you couldn't understand. Daniel turned from the window, his face etched with pain. We did think you were sick, Mom, but if I'm being completely honest, he paused, running his hand through his hair, part of me was also relieved. If you were mentally ill, then your choices weren't really your choices, and we didn't have to examine what they said about us. The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. It was the first genuinely self-aware thing Daniel had said in years. I've been thinking about something Elise said at that luncheon, Carrie added quietly, about us never having done an honest day's work. She was right, wasn't she? We inherited our privileged position, and then we spent years protecting it instead of earning it. Elise moved from her chair to sit on the arm of her grandmother's chair, taking my hand in hers. Tell them about the scholarship kids, Grandma. Tell them about Marcus Rodriguez. I smiled at my granddaughter's wisdom. She understood that redemption required not just acknowledgement of failure, but commitment to something better. Marcus was one of the first Arlington scholarship recipients, I began. Brilliant young man, first in his family to attend college. He's now a pediatric surgeon at the very hospital we celebrated tonight. When I was cleaning the Morrison estate last month, I overheard Patricia Morrison telling her bridge club that she would never let that kind of doctor operate on her grandchildren. Daniel's face flushed with shame. The kind of doctor who grew up poor? Exactly. But Marcus doesn't know that conversation happened because to him, Mrs. Morrison is just another hospital board member who smiles at fundraisers. He judges her by how she treats patients, not by her private prejudices. I stood up, moving to Arthur's portrait on the far wall. Your father always said that character reveals itself in how we treat people when we think it doesn't matter. For 3 years, I've been someone you thought didn't matter to your social standing, and now you know exactly what that revealed. Carrie stood up suddenly, wiping her eyes. What can we do, Mom? How do we fix this? You can start, I said gently, by answering a simple question. Are you ashamed of who you became when you thought I was just a cleaning lady? Or are you only ashamed of being caught? The difference between those two kinds of shame would determine whether my family could be restored or whether the damage was irreparable. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my Maple Grove home, watching through the window as Daniel taught his nephew how to properly rake leaves, a task he had never bothered with during his privileged childhood, but had insisted on learning as part of what he now called his character education. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been painful conversations, family therapy sessions, and moments when I wondered if the damage was too deep to repair. But gradually, my children began the hard work of examining who they had become and deciding who they wanted to be. Carrie had been the first to take concrete action. 2 weeks after the gala, she had quietly resigned from the exclusive Willowbrook Country Club and enrolled in a program to provide pro bono real estate services to low-income families. I need to remember what it feels like to help people instead of just impressing them, she had told me. Daniel's change had been more gradual, but perhaps more profound. He had requested a transfer to his firm's public interest division, taking a significant pay cut to work on cases involving workers' rights and employment discrimination. I want to be the kind of lawyer Dad would have been proud of, he had explained. But it was Elise who had surprised us all. She had started a blog called The Invisible Workers, interviewing and highlighting the stories of service industry employees throughout the city. Her piece on janitorial staff at her high school had gone viral, leading to improved working conditions and a scholarship fund for the children of support staff. The kitchen door opened, bringing me back to the present, as Margaret entered carrying a familiar manila envelope. The final quarterly report, she announced, settling at my kitchen table with practiced ease. The Arlington Foundation distributed $2.3 million this quarter. The scholarship program alone has 42 new recipients. I poured us both coffee and sat down to review the numbers. The foundation had grown beyond anything Arthur and I had imagined, funded not just by my original wealth, but by matching donations from people who had been inspired by our family's very public journey from shame to authenticity. There's something else, Margaret added with a smile. Carrie called this morning. She wants to know if you'd be willing to speak at her real estate association's conference next month. The topic is dignity in service, lessons from both sides of the economic divide. I laughed, remembering the woman who had once been too embarrassed to acknowledge her cleaning lady mother in public. What did you tell her? That Miranda Arlington doesn't give speeches, but Miranda Price, who spent 3 years learning about life from the ground up, might have something valuable to say. The back door burst open as Elise rushed in, still in her coffee shop uniform but glowing with excitement. "Grandma, did you see the news? The State University Board approved the Arthur Arlington Center for Working Students. They're breaking ground next month."
I hugged my granddaughter tightly, breathing in the scent of coffee and youthful determination that clung to her hair. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, sweetheart, of all of us. Even Mom and Dad? She asked, pulling back to study my face. I glanced out the window where Daniel was now helping Carrie load bags of leaves into her modest sedan, the practical car she had chosen to replace her luxury vehicle. "Especially them," I said softly. "They lost their way for a while, but they found their courage to change. That takes more character than never falling at all." As the sun set over Maple Grove, painting my small kitchen in golden light, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. I had spent 3 years as an invisible woman, scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets, learning truths about my family and myself that no amount of wealth could have revealed. The cleaning cart was gone, stored in my garage as a reminder of lessons learned. But the woman who had pushed it, Miranda Clyde, who understood the dignity of honest work, would always be part of who I was. I was no longer invisible, but I had learned the value of truly seeing others. My children were no longer ashamed of me, but more importantly, they were learning not to be ashamed of themselves when they thought no one important was watching. And in the end, that made all the heartbreak and deception worthwhile. Because love isn't just about accepting someone when they shine. It's about valuing them when they serve, supporting them when they struggle, and never, ever being ashamed of who they are when you think the world isn't looking. Some lessons can only be learned in the shadows, but once learned, they illuminate everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.